Welcome to Keep the Faith Ministry News. Early in 2020, Elizabeth Bartholet, a professor at the Harvard Law School, became notorious for advocating a, quote, presumptive ban on homeschooling. The 3 to 4% of U.S. parents who choose to educate their children at home would have to prove to educational authorities that their case is justified, and if they couldn't do so, would have their children sent to public schools. An article about Bartholet in Harvard's Alumni magazine, reiterating a position she had taken in a lengthy law review article published shortly before, provoked a furor among parents and young people, some of them Harvard graduates who had enjoyed successful homeschooling experiences. Then came the coronavirus lockdown. With public schools shuttering their brick-and-mortar classrooms and teachers' unions promising to keep them shuttered throughout the 2020 through 21 school year and beyond, the percentage of homeschooling households suddenly surged to 5.4% in late April 2020 and to 11.1% by the end of September 2020. Many of the new homeschoolers were otherwise politically liberal urbanites, and the anti-homeschooling movement quickly faded as a progressive cause. But now the homeschooling opponents are back with a new, more specific focus: Christian homeschooling. The impetus was the January 6th breach of the U.S. Capitol by disgruntled Trump supporters. It quickly became identified in the media with white nationalism and then with white Christian nationalism, on the premise that white evangelical Christians were an important voting bloc for Donald Trump in the 2020 election, and many had attended a huge Trump rally on the National Mall that day. From there, it was a quick jump to evangelical homeschools. On January 15th, the Huffington Post ran a scathing critique of Abeka Publishing and the Bob Jones University Press, which published textbooks and other materials used by many homeschooling evangelical parents. Quote, language used in the books overlaps with the rhetoric of Christian nationalism, often with overtones of nativism, militarism, and racism. Days later, Chrissy Strope, a writer for the progressive website Religion Dispatches, chimed in. It would be remiss of us to approach the where were they radicalized question without addressing how the Christian schooling and homeschooling movement, along with many white churches and other evangelical LDS and traditional Catholic institutions, fostered the subcultures presumably responsible for the Capitol break-in. A March 2nd article in MS Magazine focused on, quote, extremist, white supremacist, homeschooling curricula as the product of a decades-long crusade to deregulate home and private school education, the fruits of which are visible in such phenomenon as QAnon, COVID denialism, and Capitol riots. On April 22nd, numerous media outlets, including the Washington Post, ran a now-deleted article from the Religion News Service by progressive pastor Doug Pagitt declaring that, quote, homeschooling in conservative evangelical communities is a key channel for ideas to feed into Christian nationalism. The conservative evangelical education system has become a pipeline of extremism, Pagitt wrote. On March 30th, Philip Gorski, a sociology professor at Yale who studies American religious trends, wrote on Twitter, quote, Christian homeschooling was and is often, if not always, a major vector of white Christian nationalism. Gorky has since made his Twitter account private. None of this should come as a surprise. Although opponents of homeschooling have typically raised understandable concerns, such as whether parents with limited educations are equipped to teach math and reading, or whether some parents keep their children out of school as a pretext to abuse them, their actual animus, as expressed in their writings, is almost always directed at parents who are too religious for their taste. That means evangelical and other conservative Christians, who still account for the vast majority of homeschoolers, along with Hasidic Jews who educate their children in their own yeshivas. In her article for the Arizona Law Review, for example, Bartholet referred to what she called homeschooling parents' ideological commitment to, quote, isolating their children from the majority culture and indoctrinating them in views and values that are in serious conflict with that culture. Terms such as indoctrinate, isolate, views far outside the mainstream, and failure to expose children to alternative perspectives or to teach them to think for themselves, those are commonplaces of the academic writings of homeschooling opponents. Just to make it clear whom they are talking about, these critics typically throw in a sarcastic reference to the Bible as, quote, sacred absolute truth. Until recently, however, homeschooling opponents kept their attacks reasonably subtle. That is, they didn't come out and say directly that what they didn't like about Christian homeschooling was the Christian part. Then, the January 6th breach gave them an excuse to do exactly that, usually without being able to back up their attacks with evidence. Gorski, for example, admitted in a subsequent tweet that he had no idea how big the claimed overlap between Christian nationalists and Christian homeschoolers actually might be. It helps critics' cause, of course, that they and the media have redefined nationalism to mean mere patriotism or pride in America's history, and civilization and Christian nation to mean a theocracy instead of a country where 65% of the inhabitants of every ethnicity define themselves as Christians and hold some formulation of Christian ideals. Hence the trepidation over homeschooling textbooks from religious publishers that teach civic virtue, assert that God created the world as the book of Genesis says, and take a dim view of such progressive shibboleths as feminism, transgender activism, the 1619 Project, and climate alarmism. The notion that parents, Christian or otherwise, should be forbidden by the government to educate their children in the values that they themselves hold dear, or to be forced to expose them to values that they might find abhorrent but are definitely in the secular liberal mainstream, advocating unrestricted abortion or same-sex marriage, for example, is totalitarianism at its crudest. And now that the gloves are off the anti-homeschoolers and their real aims, it's also part of a very specific war against a large number of Christians as well. Conditions similar to the French Revolution are being developed in America. Hatred of Christians and Christianity is nothing new, but in America, the openness of it is troubling. It is really a war on the Bible and its claims. Quote, the war against the Bible, carried forward for many centuries in France, culminated in the scenes of the Revolution. That terrible outbreaking was but the legitimate result of Rome's suppression of the Scriptures. It presented the most striking illustration which the world has ever witnessed of the working out of the papal policy, an illustration of the results to which for more than 1,000 years the teaching of the Roman Church had been tending. Great Controversy, page 265. This is Keep the Faith Ministry News. Thank you for watching.